So my name's Guy Richardson. I'm a partner at Moore Kingston Smith here in London, a member firm of Moore Global, and I'm a real estate and construction partner. So I'm focused on the real estate and construction sector, providing audits, tax advice, business advice, whatever my clients need in the financial world. And we're joined by Eva MacNamara. Eva, if you'd like to do a little introduction for yourself.
Yep, sure. I'm Eva McNamara. I'm an Associate Director at Expedition Engineering, which is part of the Useful Simple Trust. I work across a variety of things in the built environment, from modern methods of construction, sustainable and regenerative design, and an innovation consultancy, which is another part of our business.
Thank you very much, Eva. And Laetitia, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, thank you. My name is Laetitia Pancrazi. I'm a Principal Sustainability Consultant at Useful Projects, which is also part of the Useful Simple Trust. I work with public and private sector organizations to help them lead a transformational program of change around particularly sustainability, the net zero agenda, circular economy change, and also nature-based solutions.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So we are talking today about repurposing of real estate specifically. And before we get into to things too deep, I think it's useful to define what we mean by repurposing, because I know I've got an idea of what repurposing is and what it isn't. So for me, it's sort of quite simple. The classic one is take a commercial office block and turn it into residential property. We've seen that quite a lot. So I'm thinking standard building, turn it into something else. But maybe repurposing is a bit broader in other quarters. And I'd like to get your guys' opinion on what is included in that repurposing bracket from your world.
Yeah, so perhaps taking a step back, kind of, if we think about the way that we've been building, actually in recent years, if you go back quite a long time, actually reuse was far more common. But in the recent kind of explosion in the way that we've been building, we've had what we call a linear economy, where we take, we make, and we waste. So it's been, let's say, cheaper, easier. We didn't know the impact on the climate to demolish buildings and rebuild. And now when we talk about repurposing and kind of really in a way going back to some of the things that were done hundreds of years ago extraordinarily well, and we're doing them again now, transforming buildings so that they can be reused for another purpose. That reuse is its highest value of the construction materials and the embodied carbon that we've put into those buildings, and it's often a more economic way of achieving the same thing as a new build, and obviously has a much better impact on the climate.
So we're not just talking about taking a building that already exists and taking it and turn it into something else. We're actually talking about what we're building now, with a view to repurposing in the future or facilitating some kind of adaptability in the future.
Yeah, so there's many different strands to it. You always want to reuse in something's highest value, and that is generally how it has already been built. So in the first instance, you might say you almost try to do nothing, that you try and repurpose the building with as minimum intervention as possible. We know that uses as little extra material as is needed. So that might be, let's say, a conversion of use. You also might say that there are parts of the building that you want to take apart and reuse elsewhere on another site. That is less common, and that's something that we're trying very hard as an industry to move towards, that being something viable. And what we're seeing with the global crisis, the fuel crisis, COVID, the grounding of the Evergreen in the Suez Canal, the Ukraine war is resource scarcity, and that means we're really going to have to think about reuse, because actually those things are going to be more accessible, more economic than the new build situation. So although we've been talking about it historically as something good to do for the climate, the economic drivers are now very much on the horizon to make this a very strong business case, as well as a good low carbon case.
So that's interesting, because when I'm thinking of repurposing, I'm thinking of a very situated situation, a building that's there or something that's going to be there. But what we've just explained there is actually we're going to take some of those things apart and put them elsewhere in other locations. And that's just as much part of the repurposing, the recycling of existing materials, rather than just that knock it down and stick it into landfill scenario.
I'll just pick apart a word there. Recycling is actually, it's the next thing along. So you want to reuse things as they currently are first. You then want to reuse them perhaps by moving them to another location. Recycling would suggest, let's say, the equivalent of recycling plastics would be, creating a new product out of that material. So that is part of the circular economy, but that's a low value reuse, because you have to put energy into doing that again. And that's definitely part and appropriate for some things in the circular economy, but you always want to be trying to intervene, I think, is probably the best way to think about, to intervene as little as possible with what you've already got.
So in this very simplistic place, take a brick and use it as a brick somewhere else, as opposed to take a brick and knock it down and use it for some other material.
Exactly.
And just to touch on a term that Eva mentioned embodied carbon. So this is different from operational carbon. Operational carbon is all the carbon emissions that you emit when you're using your buildings, so from turning the lights on, your elevators, whereas embodied carbon is the carbon that's locked inside the materials that you're using. So a unit of brick will have a certain amount of embodied carbon, and all of that contributes to carbon emissions, which is why reusing materials is really good for the environment, because it allows you to not add more of that embodied carbon into the atmosphere.
Indeed. And so I was going to come on to the question of why is this important, but I feel like you've already answered that in your answers to the first question, which, there's obviously the environmental factors of embodied carbon not being released into the atmosphere, but there's that economic argument, which is quite compelling now, which perhaps we haven't paid as much attention to until recent times, when it's becoming abundantly clear that getting resources from one location to another over long distances might prove to be a bit of a challenge going forward. So we've got some pretty compelling reasons why we should be doing this. And I quite liked your point about the fact that we're actually going back to a practice that was done many, many years ago. Is that something that's pre-industrial revolution, or is that it's more of like a recent change in the sort of 20th century that we moved away from sort of build to reuse?
I mean, in a way, it all comes down to economics and locality. Back when reuse was common, the climate crisis wasn't even something people thought about. But they knew that they couldn't easily get materials from China or even closer. They'd be using their local materials. They'd be using deconstructing and reusing their bricks if they had them, or whatever systems it was, because actually that was the lowest economic version of construction. So a lot of that is also workmanship and kind of knowledge perhaps that has been lost and we need to regain, and that's part of the kind of skills crisis that we see in the construction industry, that I think we're going to see a lot more also with social value, a lot more kind of local construction, local skills being applied to local materials. You kind of think of it as historically a kind of materials bank or inventory of what was in a reasonable transport distance. When we were able to transport things easily and create mega factories and so on, that's completely exploded. But now that we see the economic drivers coming the other way, we need to think about that locality more.
So it was almost globalization that drove us to that use and waste, use once and move on scenario. Because prior to that, there simply wasn't the ability to transport the materials over long distances. And now we're heading back that because of the limitations that we're now facing, creating the very same situation of difficulty in moving resources from one location to another. So the world has almost forced our hand away from our unhealthy practices.
I was just going to say, I mean, just sort of for context, you kind of feel, I think something like 2020, man-made products outweighed the total mass of all life on Earth. And when you think of it like that, you go, gosh, that's that, you don't need to be an expert to know that that is unsustainable, and that sooner or later we are going to need to change our practices from an environmental degradation perspective, but also from an economic perspective. We know that that will result in material scarcity, prices will go up, and so on. So reuse really becomes a no-brainer at that point.
And it's on both sides of the supply chain. So acquiring the material is getting more expensive. There's disruptions in supply chains, which is causing prices to increase throughout the built environment industry. But it's also in terms of disposing of the waste. So landfill taxes are increasing. It's more and more expensive for the built environment to dispose of this waste. So there's drivers on both sides of the equation in terms of why you should think about repurposing. And obviously there is wider societal requirements. With the energy crisis at the moment, a lot of people are being pushed into fuel poverty. And one aspect of repurposing building is repurposing them to a higher standard, particularly around, the energy performance of a building. So for example, it gives an opportunity to increase insulation, to reduce the amount of energy that a family needs to use to heat their homes, and therefore contribute to wider societal goals, which, has knock-on effects on productivity and the economy as a whole.
Indeed. So we've covered what repurposing is, which is a lot broader than even I understood. We've got the standard kind of change of use of a building. There's the upgrade in a building, as you said, the repurposing to lift standards. There's the idea of building to reuse, which is a practice that actually we knew about many years ago and kind of forgotten. And then there's that reuse the materials somewhere else. So it's quite a broad church. And there's clearly some compelling reasons to actually engage and think and invest time and effort into this, not least because it's probably going to be forced upon people due to the simple economics of the situation. So if we could move on, what do you see as sort of the key sort of challenges, the restrictions, the limitations, the things that are really holding people back from meaningfully make progress in this repurposing activity?
So I think there's a hierarchy here, really. The reuse in situ, so by that I mean, let's say you've got the skeleton of a building and you're reusing that skeleton. That is becoming more and more common. Expedition has got a long history of reusing buildings. That's let's say tricky from an engineering perspective, but as a good engineer you can make that work. What becomes difficult is when you want to move to the next level of, for example, reusing things from other sites, bringing them in, designing to a materials inventory of what may be available at the time that you are undertaking that construction. We don't yet have that critical mass of reuse of materials that means that if you do a design, you know that you'll be able to stick to the program, stick to the materials. So in a way, as designers, we need to become more flexible in the way that we design to deal with those, let's say, alternative supply chains. So it's not a traditional supply chain. It's a new type of supply chain that might be more dynamic, and our responses will need to be more dynamic. I think the challenges really are in getting quickly enough to that critical mass, which means that at scale we can really reuse in an efficient and economic way among ourselves.
So if I've understood correctly, we've been reliant on this supply chain of taking raw materials or fabricated materials from one location to another, and those supply chains have been robust enough over the course of several years to give us the access to what we need when we need it. Those supply chains have been disrupted, but we haven't got the stability in the supply chains of reuse to fill that gap yet. And so there's a bit of a hole in the middle that we somehow need to fill.
Yeah, I think it's less about stability of those new supply chains. It's more about volume of availability. So knowing that you've got a bank of beams or glass panels or doors, whatever level of reuse you're looking at, it traditionally a specification would be quite reasonably fixed. You might say that the new new types of specifications that we should be more agile, and we need to have a way to kind of test and be confident that these materials are still useful for the next service life. So different businesses are looking at different models where they take back their products that they have that they have sold, and then they essentially refurbish them and then give them back out to the market, so they've got their new warranties associated with them. I think we'll see a rise in that type of business model, which is very important, I think, in achieving what we need to achieve.
And there's a lot of movement on the sort of policy landscape. So, for example, we're seeing a lot of policy change in the past 5 years to encourage this move towards reducing waste, embedding circular design into our thinking and how buildings should be built, but also a lot of investment in storage hubs. So Useful Projects working with the West Midlands Combined Authority to look at a zero construction hub that would have exactly what Eva just described, a bank of materials. A few years ago, they announced buildings as material banks, so tagging different elements of a building to know what is their load, what is their conditions. There's lots of progress in that area that provides some security from an investment perspective that, it's here to stay. It's not going to go away. We're not going to suddenly not have to think about repurposing buildings. It's also the majority of our housing stock. So when looking at the type of opportunity, there's around 200,000 new homes being built, but there's around 50 million buildings in the UK that will need to be repurposed to higher standards.
And I think what's really encouraging as well, that we see, businesses that have got sort of portfolios of buildings thinking of themselves as a bit of a kind of ecosystem of their own materials, and they're creating, knowing that they're building in one place here and they're deconstructing in another, they have control of their own materials. If we think about those things as really high value assets, actually, and you see a building's value not only in its area, but also in what it is made of and what can be reused from that. You can imagine very soon seeing that increasing. Then they are demonstrating at a sort of small level how that is possible, and you can then extrapolate that to wider systems, and as Laetitia says, sort of council-based, which then becomes, the flow from different places, not just within one organisation.
And just a final challenge is from an investment perspective. Obviously, retrofitting has a return on investment, whether it's because you've increased the insulation of your buildings and so you have cost savings on your energy bill, or you've identified new material streams. It's been said that one lorry bin of construction material is worth about £1,000. So there's definitely revenue opportunities from repurposing, but it is a long return on investment. So often, if investors are not in the mindset that this is going to potentially take 7 to 10 years, not 2 to 6 years, it can hinder them from wanting to invest in this. So I think any mechanisms that could help investors think more in the long term, whether that's tying it to their ESG strategies or to some other corporate policies, then it means there would be more inflow of cash into repurposing, making all of these sort of enabling mechanisms like the storage hubs, like smoothing the supply of materials, much easier to realize.
I was going to give another example as well, actually, is so Baker Street that Expedition worked on quite a while now, actually, fairly early on in the sort of rise of the circular economy, before we even called it that, actually, is that the developers were looking at knock down and rebuild, and actually we proposed, let's try and reuse this building, and we managed to retain 70% of the existing structure, use targeted demolition to then increase the floor plate by an additional 30%. That saved a huge amount of carbon, but actually important economically, it saved 18 months in the programme, which meant that the whole building was let 18 months earlier than it would have otherwise, and suddenly that became the best economic option on the table. So I think there are parts of the circular economy that we need to move forward and require investment, and that will accelerate things. But there's also significant gains to be made in thinking about how that affects programme and lets. So it's really interesting coming at it from both angles.
So that's an interesting point you just made, because my mind was going to, what's the limitation in terms of information and knowledge about this? because you've got investors on the one side who are the people putting the money into these developments or repurposing or just an asset in general. You've got the strong construction businesses who are doing the underlying work. And then you've got policy from government, which is obviously driving how you do things. And I was going to ask, where are the levers that need to be pulled? And of course, they all need to be pulled in some cases. But it sounds like actually there's a big part to play in designers who are pushing forward these ideas. And if the designers are the ones that are pushing forward, actually they can demonstrate the economic argument that this is a good thing for the investor and for the contractor.
Yeah, I mean, as an engineer, I obviously would say I think that we should be involved earlier in the process, and I think it's absolutely true for circular economy. If you don't look at what you have through an engineering perspective and an unlocking of a building's potential, you may completely miss a trick. So I think the early involvement of designers is incredibly important to sort of really see how you can reuse, how you can maximize the value of what you've already got, understand the building so that risks are minimized, rather than making a decision without enough kind of early engineering judgment on it. All of that early stage de-risks the later reuse of the building and maximizes the circular economy potential of the building.
The earlier you embed sustainability consideration into any projects, the less expensive it will get. The later you wait to embed these type of sustainability measures, the more costly it gets. And just to answer on the designer, of course, designers have a really important role to play, and they have risen to the challenge. But I think it is a bit of a multi-pronged approach, and it's often the issue with sustainability is people tend to look for a silver bullet. But the fact is, you need collaboration across the investors, the developers, the contractors, the designers, the engineers, the wider energy and sustainability consultants, because it's about presenting all the information in a consistent way, and it's for any organization to embed sustainability in their decision-making process, so that, as Eva just mentioned, the fact that you reuse material means you get money because you can rent your unit 18 months more than if you hadn't done it that way. If this is thought about from the beginning of a project, and if an organization is in the mindset that this is what they're looking for, it makes it much easier for a designer to push a circular design. Because what happens a lot of the time is a designer will say, here's a circular design, here's a reduction in sustainability, but then actually, because there's an increase in cost, or because it can be a bit more complicated, or because the success metrics don't match with what the investors or the developers had in mind, then it gets stalled, and then we end up with a subpar design option. So it does take a bit of an ecosystem working together towards communal goals.
So we've kind of segued into the final point there, which is talking about opportunities that I'm thinking perhaps primarily from an investor point of view, the people who own these buildings, and you've very, very clearly identified that getting designers in early in the process of any kind of activity, or even just engaging a designer to tell you what you could do with this building, is quite essential to spotting opportunities, an economic benefit that otherwise could go completely under the radar and wouldn't get noticed. So straight off the bat, engaging with designers is a clear opportunity for investors to make the most of the buildings they have. What other opportunities do you see in this environment, either from a particular activity, a particular asset class that's prime for doing something with? Where do you see the real opportunities that we can get hold of in this space?
I see a lot of opportunity with residential properties. So obviously there's, Eva mentioned a few examples with commercial properties. So just moving to residential properties, as said, we are moving away from a generation of people that buy houses towards one that rent houses. There's an opportunity for investors to buy a larger housing stock, to retrofit it to higher standards, and then to rent it, whether it's affordable renting. We work with investors like Castleforge Partners and their branch Ocasa Homes. They retrofit houses and then rent it at an affordable price to help people onto the housing market. But then obviously you could do the same thing more like a luxury brand grand and rent it at a higher cost. But there's an opportunity for investors to do this at scale, which reduces the cost of retrofitting and upgrading these properties. From a legal perspective, the UK has made a commitment to be net zero by 2050, and a huge amount of that carbon is locked into our existing homes. So we will have to think about how we're going to retrofit those houses, because there's a lot of effort at the moment focused on how do we get new builds to be extremely sustainable, but actually the real challenge is going to be our existing housing stock. There's obviously an opportunity to future-proof your investment portfolio. So if you already own a lot of properties, whether they're commercial or residential, again, from a policy perspective, by 2025, you will not be able to rent a property if it's not up to the EPCC. So again, that's quite a big uplift. So again, you may want to take into account how can you do that in a way that not only reduces carbon, but can potentially generate a new revenue stream for your organization. And then the final one, I think, is around your ESG and your corporate policy. We're seeing a lot of more investors that are turning towards green investment opportunities, and there's a chance to be amongst the first one and to trial innovative methods. So Eva mentioned, she works in modern methods of construction. There's also advanced methods of construction, lots of new ways to deliver, new repurposed properties that could be quite interesting for investors across the world and could help the UK meet some of its industrial strategy goals towards global competitiveness.
I think I'd also add to that. I think there's two strands of the way that we'll move circular economy forward. One is that reuse in situ as its highest value, and then the other is designed for disassembly and deconstruction, and that would be for new build type projects. So that might be modular construction, other modern methods of construction, and we're seeing a huge amount of investment in modular construction, for example. That will take off for many different reasons as part of the government's construction playbook. So we see the government backing these forms of construction, and those are kind of the two strands, really, I think, to the circular economy in terms of investment.
And there's perhaps a small opportunity in people who have land or assets that they really can't do a great deal with, that actually they can repurpose that land for the reusable materials storage, and bring that into be part of that repurposing cycle, and using something that currently isn't really that usable for any other purpose. So there's quite a few different opportunities within this that we could have. I think that's great. So I think we've covered a lot. We've got what is repurposing, and it's a lot broader than perhaps we all think, and there's a lot more strands to it. There's certainly risks and challenges involved, but at least they're getting us into a cycle of reusing materials and having that availability there to do these things, and the knowledge and engaging people at the right time to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are clearly there. But if you can do those things, then the opportunities are clear. And as you've described with several examples, there's a lot of economic benefits in approaching a repurposing model and thinking a lot differently about the standard, let's just knock it down and start again approach, which often people default to. Well, thank you very much, Eva, and thank you very much, Laetitia. That was fantastic, really useful. And I think we've provided a great deal of information for people and investors to think about repurposing in their portfolios and in their assets.